Hello, church family. Thank you for taking time to watch this video, a video where I will share with you what I believe to be one of the most important matters of prayer in the history of our church. By now you are aware that our church leadership several months ago reached a settled conviction from God that our future as a church was as a multi-site church. In other words, rather than continue to grow larger on one campus and build bigger and bigger buildings, we believed that it was the will of God for us to become one church on multiple smaller campuses. This will allow us to be able to take the ministry that God is blessing here at Blue Valley Baptist Church and export it into the communities around us. The average distance of a multi-site campus from the original campus is about 10 to 20 minutes in an area where a large segment of that church's population already lives and works. And at the Giving Thanks banquet several months ago, you gave us some very important information about where you, as our church family, live and work. And as a result of that, we were able to identify two areas where we could potentially start a second campus for our church. But the most obvious of those areas was Olathe. 50% of our Sunday school attendance on any given Sunday lives in the 66062 zip code. And even more specifically, most of those live between 135th and 159th and Flum and I-35. Thus, you confirmed for us what our church staff had long suspected, that we were a prime candidate to launch another campus in Olathe. In fact, when our pastors first began to talk about a multi-site future in the fall of 2012, Olathe seemed to us to be a fairly inevitable choice. Now, our options for launching a new campus in that area really run the gamut. We could, for instance, find empty retail space and purchase it and repurpose it for church work. Or we could, in a more temporary fashion, find a school where we could, every week, set up a room for us to be able to do worship and several rooms for us to be able to do Sunday schools. And we continue to explore those possibilities. But there's also another possibility. 1/3 of all multi-site churches begin as the result of a church merger, with a smaller church merging with a larger church. And the larger church then has its first campus site in the location of the smaller church. Knowing this about multi-site churches, our pastors began to discuss the idea of perhaps talking to a church in Olathe when and if the time came for us to launch an Olathe campus. And with all of that thought, we began to really center on one particular church as a possibility, Fellowship Baptist Church, which is just north of the Garmin campus, just north of Olathe South High School. Fellowship Baptist Church currently averages about 100 people in worship attendance, and its facilities sit on approximately 7 acres of property. They are debt-free, and they have an annual budget of about $236,000. Their only full-time staff member is their recently hired pastor, a great fella by the name of Steve Scott, who's an Oklahoma City native, who has a Master of Divinity from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary with an emphasis in biblical languages. They also currently have a part-time student minister who will be a student at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary this fall. Last month, I asked our multi-site task force for their blessing in approaching the pastor of Fellowship Baptist Church simply to float the idea of Blue Valley launching a second campus in Olathe to gauge if there was any interest on Fellowship's part in joining us in that endeavor. But before that meeting was arranged, we figured out that God was already up to something. Donnie Simpson, who is the Director of Missions for the Kansas City, Kansas Baptist Association, had already been having conversations with the leadership of Fellowship Baptist about considering a merger with a larger church in general and Blue Valley Baptist Church specifically. Donnie was stunned when I called to talk to him about Fellowship, saying that he had intended to call me the very next day about the possibility of our two churches merging. That conversation led to a very informal meeting with Donnie, Fellowship's pastor, and one of their elders, a man by the name of Chris Smith, where our chairman of deacons, Jim Feller, and I talked with them about the possibilities of our churches merging. We agreed to spend a week in prayer and report back to our respective leadership, and at the end of the week, we came back together, having reached the conclusion that God was leading our churches to take the next step. And so, we are beginning formal discussions with the leadership of Fellowship Baptist Church about the possibility of their merging with Blue Valley and the two of us becoming one church family. We would then spend several months integrating as one church and refurbishing that property in order to relaunch from that location as Blue Valley Baptist Church Ridgeview campus sometime before the end of the year. Now, obviously, this is sooner than our announced timeline of a September 2015 launch of a second campus. But as I shared with you in our Giving Thanks banquet, we needed to be prepared for God to alter our plans. And it appears that God may just be doing that. So what comes next? Well, both churches and their leadership will have to do their due diligence. For Blue Valley Baptist Church, that means three things. First, we must obtain an architectural review of the Fellowship Baptist Church campus. We need to know what kind of investment we would need to make in the property in order to prepare it to become a second campus for Blue Valley Baptist Church. Second, we will need to conduct an independent audit of Fellowship Baptist Church's financial records. This will allow us to have a clear picture of the financial situation at Fellowship Baptist. And then finally, we will need to conduct a legal review. We will need to make sure there are no pending legal issues or rights to their property, as well as make other legalities of our two churches becoming fully understood. In addition to doing our due diligence, we will need to do the following. We'll need to form a feasibility study team comprised of members of both churches. This will allow us to discuss all issues related to a merger between our two churches and also to have those issues explored more fully and negotiated. The Blue Valley representatives on this team will be chosen from the existing multi-site task force. Next, we will need to enlist coaching help. We've secured the coaching help of Jim Tomberlin of Multi-Site Solutions. Jim is the world's foremost expert on multi-site churches and has written the book, literally, on church mergers. He has coached literally dozens of churches during the merger process, and his help will be invaluable. And then finally, we will commit to over-communicate every step of the way. You will have weekly updates through our eDove, our website, our Facebook page, and our Twitter feed on the progress. We'll also give you verbal updates every Sunday in worship. In other words, as soon as we know something, we'll share it. That is our commitment to you. Now, if the Lord leads, at some point in the next few months, the folks at Fellowship Baptist will vote on whether or not to merge with Blue Valley Baptist. As Blue Valley will not be purchasing any property or acquiring any debt, there will be no need for us to vote on the merger. But we must remember something very important. Churches don't join churches. People join churches. So if a merger takes place, we'll be given the chance to welcome those members of fellowship who decide to become a part of our church family. Both church families now know about these discussions. Please understand that there are more questions than answers at this point. But our commitment is to move as quickly as possible to bring these discussions to whatever conclusion is the Lord's will. We simply ask you to commit to pray. My prayer is that God will give clarity to the members of Fellowship Baptist about the future that God has for them, and that God will make Blue Valley willing to receive whatever His ultimate will is for our church family. I appreciate your time, and I love being your pastor.